So just a brief overview of kind of what we're going to be doing so you can see. First, we'll define what is VR so that we're all on the same page there, because like I said, there's a lot of different kind of interpretations. I'm going to briefly talk about the benefits of using it for language learning in terms of what the research has shown, but I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but just a few minutes so you kind of understand. And then we'll look at different types of VR devices. So there's kind of a spectrum and they range in kind of quality as well as price. So we'll look at that, and then also kind of an overview of the different types of applications that are already available that you could be using. And then I'm going to dive into kind of my favorite apps. And the ones I chose today are already made. Most of them are free and or very cheap. And they're also, you have the ability to work with your students privately in them, which is important. We'll talk about privacy too. And then general tips and advice on integrating VR and getting headsets, because that's always kind of the barrier to doing this work. So what is VR? Very broadly, we can break VR into two categories. So we have low immersion virtual reality, and that is really accessing something via a computer desktop. So not involving any headsets. If you're familiar with Second Life or even things like The Sims, that could be considered low immersion VR in terms of how we've defined it in the research. And then high immersion VR is typically accessed via, well, always accessed using a headset. Here you can see this is an example of one. It's the Meta Quest 2. It's kind of the most like popular VR application or headset right now on the market. At kind of like a middle range price, but these can look differently depending on the headset you choose. And today we're really going to be focused on high immersion VR. So I'm not going to be talking about low immersion VR, just so we're kind of clear moving forward. But I will say that a lot of the apps I'm going to be showing you can be accessed either both via a headset or on the desktop computer. And I did that intentionally because, as we'll talk about, headsets can be expensive and they're definitely a major barrier. So this helps kind of make it more accessible to more students, but we will be primarily looking at high immersion virtual reality today. In terms of why should we care? So VR is definitely kind of becoming a fad. I started working on it a couple of years ago, and then we had COVID, and then we had the metaverse announcement by Mark Zuckerberg. And since then, it's really kind of been, you know, I don't know if you've heard, but lots of people are talking about the metaverse, blah, blah, blah. I don't consider it to be here, but I do think we will be seeing more VR use in education, and we should be paying attention. So just very briefly, 8.52 million headsets were sold so far in 2022, and in 2021 it was around 5 million. So we are seeing an uptick. This is largely because these headsets, for the most part, are becoming more affordable. They used to be, you know, VR has been around for a while, but they used to be extremely, extremely expensive. Now you can buy a headset off the shelf that doesn't require a high-end computer, which just makes it a lot more accessible. It's predicted that there's going to be 43.5 million headsets being sold just by 2025, which really is not that far off at this point. And we're expected to see a 28% growth in VR usage in the field of education by 2024. So that's why I said I do think we will be seeing more of this in education. Let's look briefly at the previous research. So another reason why should we care? In terms of language learning specifically, you know, a lot of people are proponents of VR because it's experiential learning. You can actually immerse your students in these highly contextualized situations that you couldn't do before without actually going to the target country or, you know, traveling somewhere. So that's kind of one of the main reasons people are pushing for it. Again, there's a lot of like role playing that you can do in VR that is much easier to do than if you're just in a classroom having to imagine everything. A lot of these platforms are also very interactive and allow for students to collaborate and build things together or make things together inside VR. And then in terms of research, we've seen that VR does increase motivation and engagement. I will say we don't have any, you know, studies that have looked at this in terms of language learning specifically over the course of like a 6-month or year-long period. Right now, a lot of the research is more shorter term just because these headsets are expensive and it's hard to find participants. But the results we have so far are very encouraging in terms of motivation and engagement. And we've also seen that VR can lower anxiety. This is largely due to the fact that, well, several things, but partly that students are hidden in a sense behind an avatar. So a lot of them have reported feeling more comfortable speaking since they're not able to be completely seen by their peers. For some students, it feels more like a game, more relaxed, so that contributes to lower anxiety. And this instance fosters a willingness to communicate, which is what we all want with our students, of course. And then this has all been found to then translate to improvement in actual learning. So we've had in the VR research, a lot of studies have looked at the how students learn vocabulary in VR. And there's been some interesting work that has shown that they actually do learn better than in the classroom because they're able to pick up objects, interact with them, see them in context, and that they also have better retention over time as well. There's also been some studies that have looked at how VR impacts learning of pragmatics and kind of, putting students in situations where they role play and act out different scenarios with either AI bots or other people in VR, and that have shown to lead to better learning, listening, pronunciation, and speaking. This has been found to go back to anxiety, of course, and then actually reading as well. A study recently came out, which was surprising. There hasn't been a lot of work done on reading and writing in VR, because it is better for obviously speaking and listening. But we do have some work that has come out that has shown that students actually have better reading comprehension because of all the context surrounding what they're reading. So that's just a brief summary about the research. I can definitely talk more about it in the Q&A if anyone's interested, but I don't really want to spend too much time diving into that right now. So let's talk about the types of VR devices that are actually available for use. There's kind of three different categories. So you have viewing devices, and that's essentially anything like Google Cardboard, or they have other types of headsets that you essentially put your smartphone in. Okay, so these are why these are quite accessible, because most of our students already have a smartphone that can work with these devices. But I will say you're not going to get the same level of immersion, and you can't necessarily use the same types of apps. And we'll kind of talk a little bit about that as we move forward. So this is definitely cheaper into the spectrum. Like a Google Cardboard or a knockoff Google Cardboard can literally be like $5. So they're really, really affordable. Then you have standalone headsets. These are essentially fully immersive head-mounted displays that don't have to be tethered to a computer, which is important. It does make them a lot more accessible. They're more expensive than the viewing devices. So I will say the Meta Quest 2, this is the one you saw on the past slide that is really kind of like the go-to right now. These are $399 and like $399. So we'll talk a bit about acquiring these later and how you can do it with your students, but they are, even though these are the cheap ones, they're not cheap. Then you have the HTC Vive. They're also coming out with a Quest Pro. They just made a big announcement. Meta made a big announcement last week, in case you saw that. That's going to be $1,500, so it's not, I wouldn't recommend it. And then you also have tethered to a computer, which these, a lot of times you'll see if your university or school has like a virtual reality lab, these are a lot of times the types of headsets they have in those. I don't recommend these in terms of when you're trying to get them for your classroom, because you have to have both the headset and a high-powered computer to connect it to. So for most teachers, you definitely want to stay kind of in this end of the spectrum, the viewing devices and the standalone headsets. I'm just opening the chat. Yes, I can. Hold on, I need to scroll up. Yes, I will show you. I do actually have a reference list prepared for y'all. So that's more like pedagogical. Can you still see my screen? Okay, the green outline disappeared, so I wanted to make sure. I have a list prepared for y'all though. Okay, so let's move on from here. Let's talk about the types of VR platforms. So I have kind of broken them into different categories, and then we'll look at a few platforms in more detail. But You have apps that are designed specifically for language learning. And then you also have kind of general social VR platforms that already exist that a lot of people are still using for education. So in terms of apps specifically created for language learning, those can be broken into two different categories. You have ones that are human to computer interaction, and then you have ones that are human to human interaction. Human to computer is obviously ideal if you want your students to do something asynchronously, either going to a VR lab and practicing something, doing this from home. And then human to human would typically require you to be in VR with your students, doing something with them. But we'll look at that in a little more detail as we go through. So here are two examples, well, the only two examples really of the human to computer interaction VR apps designed for language learning. I will say people are constantly developing more, but these are the two that I've seen that are actually built out that could add some value. You have Mondly, which is about, I want to say it's $10. It's more affordable than ImmerseMe, but ImmerseMe we'll look at in the following slide. One thing that's really nice about it is they've recorded all of their interactions in actual real locations in the target country or target countries of the language the students are learning. But essentially the way these work is the student puts on a headset, they get in the app and they interact with an AI computer bot. So it's better, I think, for lower level students who are still kind of practicing those scripted interactions of like ordering a coffee or buying something at the store. And then you have apps that allow for human to human interaction. So the only one designed for language learning that does that is the one that I work for, called Immerse, which you'll see in the later slide too. But essentially the way this works is you have the teacher teaching students in VR, and you're able to immerse them in a variety of situations, ranging from like a restaurant to a coffee shop, to a hospital, to a park, to a home, depending on what you're working on with students.
Tricia, there's a question from the chat. Is ImmerseMe available in Switzerland? Or maybe more generally, are these apps available in other countries?
Yes, I believe all of these are available worldwide. I'm not sure about specific countries, but it should be available, Megan. ImmerseMe is actually out of Australia. So they're pretty international, but that's a great question. Yeah, all the ones we're looking at today, I don't think there's any geographical constraints. Then there's general social VR platforms. These are not designed for education necessarily, but there are a lot of people in language learning and other fields who are using them for educational purposes. There's one called Alcove that we'll look more at in a few slides. VTime XR is one that I used with my students for my research. And basically the whole idea of these is to bring students together into a physical space where they can collaborate on something or build something or visit, you know, a location that's relevant to what you're teaching. And then we also have games, which are already created. You have multiplayer games that students can obviously play in the target language together. Rec Room is essentially like a social VR platform that has all different types of games in it, ranging from board games to like basketball to, I mean, they have really anything you could think of that students can play together. You also have games like Keep Talking, Nobody Explodes, which is really, it sounds kind of threatening, but it's really a game where they have to negotiate meaning. So you can really play it in any language. And then they also do have single player games that can be played in a variety of languages already. So there's one called Elixir that's actually available for free. And it's available in English, French, Spanish, German, Italian, and I believe even some other languages. And it's all about students have to listen to what they're hearing and follow the instructions. They're essentially like an apprentice learning to be like a sorcerer or something. But I do have a resource at the end to give you specifically on this app that talks about how you can use it in listening comprehension activities. And then here's just another game that is available in a lot of languages in VR. And then the last kind of category
another question. Have you worked with Engage?
I have done some stuff with Engage. I did not include it here because typically people working in Engage are building things in Engage. So it's not necessarily, I would say, beginner level, but it's definitely being used a lot for education. And then I think we had another, we tried to get Immerse Me in My School in the UK, but did not pass the data protection for minors at the time. Yeah, one thing with all of VR, especially K through 12, is I know every school kind of has their own requirements when it comes to like privacy and data. So that can always be a little tricky. The next category we have is kind of like, I'm calling them exploration and 360 video tours. These are nice. If you go to like YouTube VR or really any Google search, will bring you back a ton of 360 video tours for essentially anything you're looking for pertaining to the country you're talking about. And then Wonder, we'll see it in some more detail in the following slide, but it's essentially Google Earth meets VR. And students can actually walk around and take tours together. And I'll talk about that more a little bit in a minute. Okay, any questions before we dive into like looking at some more apps in detail? Are there any apps especially? Yes, there are apps especially addressed for adult students. Maria will look at some of them. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So like I said, now we're gonna kind of just look more in detail at some of these apps. We're gonna look specifically at Immerse Me. So Megan, I think you're the one that said you tried to use this in the UK and it didn't pass the data requirements, but this is could definitely be an app that's designed for adults, Maria. Essentially what they've done is they've gone around and recorded a bunch of 360 videos, and then when the students are in the headset, they can either, or they respond using voice. And so it gives them feedback on their pronunciation as well. One thing about Immerse Me as well is you can access it from a desktop computer too. So you don't have to have a VR headset. Again, just keep in mind if you're doing it on the desktop versus in VR, you're not going to have the same level of immersion. But I figured when we're talking about how it works, it's probably easier just to show you. It's kind of hard to explain how VR apps work if you've never seen them. So I'm just going to show you a snippet of kind of what it looks like, and then we'll keep going.
So far, what is Immerse Me's pedagogical value? Immerse Me transports students into a virtual 360-degree environment and allows them to interact with native speakers across 9 world languages. But we plan to continue developing content for dozens of languages moving forward. Immerse Me is intuitive, easy to use, and available on any device, such as a desktop, tablet, mobile, and virtual reality headset. We believe this makes Immerse Me one of the
So you can kind of get a feel for what it looks like. What was I gonna say? In terms of pricing for Immerse Me, they don't list the pricing on the website because I was trying to find that for all of you. Megan, you might be able to chime in, or Maria, you might be able to chime in here. Or no, Megan, sorry. But they do say that they work with schools to do bundle subscriptions. So it seems like they're mindful of making it more affordable. And like I said, for me, Immerse Me, I don't really see using it like live in a class because then your students are kind of all in their headset doing their own thing, but having it be more of like an extra credit opportunity or something that students do outside of class time to keep practicing. Okay, for live teaching, obviously my top app is the only one that exists. It's Immerse. Essentially, like I said earlier, Immerse is the first VR application that was designed for like real-time language teaching and learning. So the whole idea is that the teacher teaches students from their computer to allow for more teacher control, which is really important in VR. Once you have a lot of students kind of in their headsets, you want to be able to control what they're doing and interact with them easily. And then students join from a VR headset, or they can also join from a desktop computer. So that's always an option. The app includes 35 different locations. So I think I mentioned earlier, we have things like, you know, a restaurant, a doctor's office, a park. Here you can see kind of like a debate room. And students are in these spaces interacting with the teacher, but also they can interact with different objects in the environment, which is important, as we know, for vocabulary learning. Right now, the way that Immerse works is students actually pay a monthly fee to take live language classes with some of our language instructors, and we actually have one of them here. So if she wants to pop in and talk about Immerse, she can. So for this reason, again, I would suggest it for like additional practice outside of class time. We do work, though, I will say, with teachers who want to use it with their students and offer opportunities to do that. But it's definitely ideal for kind of out of class practice. And there's also some asynchronous activities on the platform as well. Those are mostly centered around vocabulary learning and students doing peer-to-peer role plays in VR. But again, I have a little video to show you what it looks like kind of when you're in there with students, because it's kind of hard to imagine. But this is a clip taken from when myself and a professor at the university named Dr. Sadler, we were teaching 6th grade English learners in Spain using this platform, and we were working on descriptions. And so we were in the art gallery and we were playing like a guess who game, where the students have to essentially guess or describe a portrait, and then the other students have to try to guess who they are. So I'm just going to show you briefly what this looks like.
Okay.
Okay, is a girl?
It's a girl. Nice. Okay.
Yes.
First clue. It's a girl. There's several girls. Okay. What can you tell us more?
Is old.
She's old. An old girl. Okay, I think I know. Can you tell us something else?
Yes. Her hair is gray.
Her hair is.
Okay, so you get the idea. She's obviously describing that one over there. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. I realize we're already at 7:30, or not 7:30, 11:30. So I want to be mindful of time. This is a social VR space called Spatial, and initially it was designed for actually business. And so when they first created the platform, the only thing they really had was a bunch of like meeting rooms and places you could put up a PowerPoint, which isn't really ideal, right? Because we can do that in our normal classroom. So there's no point in hopping into VR for that. But they've kind of rebranded themselves now as the metaverse for culture. And I would agree it's actually quite an accurate, I guess, like self-explanation. So in Spatial right now, it's a platform that people can create in, so it's constantly expanding, and you're constantly having creators build out new spaces, but you don't have to do that. You could definitely use some of the pre-made locations as well. But in terms of language learning, people have already built in their replications of like Japanese streets that actually have stores that you can go in and look at different products. Someone's created like a French coffee shop where everything is in French. You can go in and, you know, role play that. It's also really accessible, which I like. So it's available in VR, pretty much any VR headset you can imagine, as well as on a desktop computer. So you're not required to buy a headset to use this app. And I will say that it's a public social VR platform, but you can create private spaces in here as well that are password protected. So you don't have to worry about running into strangers necessarily. So in these images, you can see this is an art gallery. A lot of people are using Spatial for that purpose. And I will say I'm actually working on a telecollaborative exchange research study right now that's going to be between students from the University of Illinois learning Japanese and students in Japan learning English. And part of their exchange is actually going to be them putting together a gallery at the end in Spatial, showcasing the work they've made together and the different things they've learned about each other's cultures. But here, one thing I'll point out, and then you'll see in this video briefly, is They have in each space, you can also create portals. And so students can kind of get in and hop around to different locations together. And let me show you what that looks like. I'm going to mute this guy because he's just a random YouTuber. But you can see here he's in his home space. And then now he's going to travel to Spatial Park, which is one of their main locations, where a lot of people in the community have created different artwork, and you can kind of walk around and explore and talk about it. So that's what that app looks like. Like I said, it is social in nature, so you have to be mindful of privacy, but it's easy to create a private space.
And there's a question about that. How would a stranger potentially get in?
How would a stranger potentially? So if you've never been in VR, it's kind of hard to imagine, but there are people who are actually in these spaces all the time. So if I were to get into Spatial right now and go to like Spatial Park, there would be random strangers from all over the world, just like there is on any social media, kind of walking around. So that's what I mean, you can expose your students to that if you want. Personally, I've always kept students in a private space because for obvious reasons, it's the internet, people are hidden behind avatars, so you never know what they're gonna do. But Spatial, you can make it password protected, and then students have to have a link, so you don't have to worry about that. So that's a good question. Yeah, it is a little creepy, 100%. Okay, let's talk about Alcove. Alcove is also a social VR space, but it's, sorry, here's someone. It's a social VR space, but it's private. So students have to go in and add people into the home space with them, and only 4 people are allowed at a time. So it's better for kind of students working in small groups. But this app was actually designed for the American Association of Retired People. And so it's very user-friendly, and also some VR apps are more or less comfortable physically in terms of like movement. They can make you nauseous. So this app is really good about that, which is another reason I included it here. But it's essentially a virtual house where students can meet up. They can watch videos together. If you can see these pictures back here, they can customize these, so they can bring in pictures of, you know, their home, their whatever they want to talk about for the day. There's also games built in here that students can play together. And then they also have a travel room, which already has pre-loaded, like fully immersive tours that students can take together. So for example, if they come in the travel room, you can't see it right now because I have this pulled up, but there's like a little red bus that's behind here. I can click on it and then jump into like a bus tour of Paris, of the different monuments. And everyone that is in the app will go on that tour together. Another thing that's nice about Alcove is if you click on the globe here, it will take you to Wander, which is an app that we're going to talk about in a second, but that's the one that I said is essentially Google Earth meets VR. So students can kind of jump into different locations together. But yeah, so this is definitely an interesting space, and it's very private and very safe, and it is very family friendly. So it's good for students. The last one that I'm including for the social spaces that a lot of people, or I've seen a lot of work done in terms of language learning research, is Mozilla Hubs. It's another platform that's really accessible. So it's available on pretty much every VR headset, computers, phones. It's free. You can actually you can build things in here very easily. They have a lot of templates that you can choose from. And then they also have a massive database of 3D objects that you can bring in to customize the space to fit whatever you need based on what you're doing with your students. You can also bring in images, documents, PDFs, etc. So it's really easy to customize without having like a coding background compared to some other apps. And yeah, I'm just going to show you this video briefly so you can see what it looks like kind of when people are in here. Here you can see we have a screen. We have a lot of people walking around. They're talking about how it can be used for conferences and things like that. I will say that Mozilla Hubs is another one that technically is social, but when you create the space, you have a code, and then you give that code to whoever you want to join. So it's not social in the sense that students are just going to run into someone. It's very contained, so to speak. And then this is Wonder. So here you can just see what it looks like. Some interesting things with Wonder are that you can go anywhere, but what I really like about it is that students can actually do tours together. So what I've done with students before is have them in Wonder, exploring different cities together and having to describe what they're seeing, or give a tour of that city to their classmate, and they can actually hear each other and talk to each other in real time. A lot of major monuments or museums, or for example, I did a lesson with students where we looked at different castles in France. You can walk around the inside and do the tour like you would be able to do in real life. So that is very, very useful. And another thing that's interesting about Wonder is they have a new feature. It's kind of like a time hop. So you can go to a location and you can view what that location looked like in 2021, 2019, 2017, and so on and so forth. And so if you want to talk about changes or how things have evolved, it's a really interesting way to do that with students. Okay, let me check our time. So I'm going to briefly talk about the general tips on integrating VR. So the first thing is training. Like, I really, really cannot emphasize enough the importance of training. And this goes for training both yourself and your students to use the headsets. A lot of people I've heard say things like, oh, well, the younger generation just knows how to use this. They can come in and just put it on. That is not true. I've taught with VR a lot. Students, it's not intuitive for everyone. So what I would recommend is that you actually practice teaching someone, like a friend or someone at home, before trying to explain it to an entire classroom of students, because you'll notice everyone kind of goes through the same steps in trial and error, and everyone kind of gets hung up on the same spots. So this will give you an idea of like the types of questions that will come up when students try to put on a headset for the first time. And then once you're actually ready to teach your students to use the headsets, I would suggest I found that like 2 class periods when I was doing my research was needed. 1 class period, so in class periods were 50 minutes. So you can, adapt. But I found that 50 minutes was not enough. They just really need time to be able to use it comfortably. And that will ensure that once you actually start your lesson, you're not having to waste a lot of time on technological issues. So that's something to be mindful too. Like, if you're actually planning on using VR in a headset, are you going to be using it enough to make the training worth it? Because it does take time. And then one thing that I will say that's really important for training purposes is in the VR headsets, they have the opportunity to cast. It's called a casting feature. And that's where you can basically, you select it and then it shows what the person is seeing in VR on like either the desktop computer or a TV. You can link it to whatever you have, but it's really, really helpful when you're guiding students through what to do. Because I will say, the first time I did training, I tried to just I would tell students, describe to me what you're seeing. And it's really, really hard to walk someone through VR if you can't see what they're seeing, especially if they're not familiar with being inside a headset. And this also lets you demo to students what they should be seeing as well before they try it. In terms of equipment and classroom setup, so ideally, I think it makes the most sense to not have students all in the same classroom, but for them to be using this remotely. That's mostly how I've done it. But if you're going to have them all using it in a VR lab or something, make sure that you do allow time to set up your VR equipment beforehand. It'll really help things run smoothly. And I mean, like, triple check like that your headsets are charged, connected to Wi-Fi. Even if you think they are, you should double check. Some school networks can be more difficult or not to connect to Wi-Fi because of security features. So that's all stuff that you'll want to work out beforehand. Making sure that the app is not only downloaded, but also updated. They have frequent updates, and these are all things that can slow you down if you're not careful about them. But the ideal is that your students can then come in, put on their headsets, and immediately get to work, and you won't be, you know, losing time. If they are doing this from home, I would really suggest emailing them a lot beforehand to remind them to make sure everything's set up, charged, connected, because it's a lot of students, I found at least, struggled to remember that. And then privacy and safety features. So again, those of you who are working with K through 12 students, it's important to be really mindful of that, obviously. So I would say in the private spaces, there are a lot of social VR apps like Engage. I am not familiar enough to know if you can make private spaces and Engage. I'm assuming you can, but you just want to be mindful of that. I would say better safe than sorry. And then getting VR heads.
Sorry,
Yeah.
there are a couple more questions that came through the chat. Is there anything similar to the old Google Expeditions for virtual guided tours?
Yeah, so they discontinued Google Expeditions, and I don't think there's like another platform, but I will say that there's a lot of content that's been created. Like you'd be surprised at like how many like already pre-done 360 tours you can find. So that's a really good question. What is the most adequate app to use in class with adult students who haven't worked before these tools? I would say, I mean, it kind of depends on what you want to do. That's always the main thing. Like, what do you actually do with your students, and then which app would make sense? So for example, if you're wanting them to visit like a culturally relevant place, you'd probably use Wonder. You wouldn't go and use like Immerse or Immerse Me. So I will say that kind of depends on it. And then also, if you're wanting, I will say Wander is pretty intuitive. Immerse Me is very self-guided and pretty intuitive. And then from the social spaces, I think Alcove is probably the easiest to navigate. I'm trying to think like once you're inside the headset in terms of controls, I would say Alcove is pretty easy. Sorry, I use them as a student. It's not, yeah, that's what I mean. Like a lot of people think students will just be able to figure it out, and you do need to allow for training time. But let's talk briefly about headsets, because right now this is definitely the biggest barrier. So like I said earlier, the MetaQuest 2, which is like the one that everyone's kind of saying is affordable, it's $400 alone. So once you multiply that by the number of students in your class, it's not feasible for a lot of teachers, understandably. So some things that I will say to help with that is you don't have to have a set of like 20 headsets for all your students. You could consider buying like 3 to 4 headsets, or 5 or 6, whatever you can afford. I've done studies and worked with students before where we only had 6 headsets to use with 24 students. So we essentially broke them into groups and had them rotate through like different corner activities. And we had a VR corner where they were able to do the activity in VR. So this can definitely help with cost. I would also try to position it to your school as, if you buy a set of headsets that can be used not only by language teachers, but also by the biology teachers and the chemistry teachers and the history teachers, because there's a lot of VR apps designed for those subjects as well. So this might make, from the school's standpoint, it seem a little more reasonable. But I will say I would start small. I bought a set of like 15 headsets that were Google or Oculus Go's that were pretty much considered obsolete at this point because the technology evolves so quickly. So that's another reason to, buy a few and don't feel like you need 20. Another thing I will say is, especially for K through 12 teachers, companies like Meta right now are like trying to give headsets away for free. So anyone, this is a shameless plug, but anyone who is in the US right now that is a K through 12 teacher that wants to do VR with their students, please email me after this. I'll put my email up on the last slide, but I have a set of 500 VR headsets that we have to get out to K through 12 schools. And we're ideally going to be doing 30 or 40 a school so that we can get it into as many schools as possible. But I am looking for people to give these to for free. So please contact me. Unfortunately, it's only the US that's the stipulation of the grant, but I will say these types of companies are trying to donate them out to schools. So reach out to their education departments and just ask. You'd be surprised at how many you could potentially get. In terms of universities, for our university teachers here, a lot of your universities do have VR labs on campus that students can go to. A lot of libraries have loanable tech that you can have students check out for free. So I would definitely talk to these resources. Go talk to like the engineering, the STEM side of campus. They have I would be shocked if they don't have the VR resources. A lot of times they just don't think of us over in languages until you tell them. But in my experience, once you talk to them, they're pretty willing to help. And then last but not least, if you can't get access to any of these, there are the cheaper VR devices like Google Cardboard, or even just having them do some of these apps on their desktop computers that are definitely accessible. So you could still, it's not an all or nothing thing, is what I'm trying to say. And then here, if you scan, and I'll put the link too, just give me 1 second. If you scan that QR code, I have kind of like combined a list of just running, and I just put it in the chat as well. These are like pedagogical based articles. These aren't research based because I figured people here would be more interested in the practical applied, but you have a whole list of articles. A lot of those are different kind of case studies where people talk about how did they use a specific app with their students. They give sample lesson plans. They talk about, you know, just general tips and tricks for getting started with VR. So definitely look at that. And if you want more like research resources, please email me.